Guys, first of all, thank y'all for coming this early. This is a subcommittee to discuss, I guess, technically SB 450, but it's also HB 923, and it's to discuss the issue of baiting. As I said in the prior committee meeting, all know I don't care for baiting. I think there's a whole host of reasons why I think it's not a good thing for the hunter community. A whole host of reasons. But I think it was 2011, the overwhelming, I guess, social piece of hunting pretty much won the day as far as baiting was concerned. And it is now back because that bill only addressed the southern piece of it. Before us in this General Assembly are two bills, the House bill and now the Senate bill, which addresses the northern zone. For a little reminder as to 2011 and some of the issues that were brought up, I believe that they were, let's put it this way, passed over. And as I said the other day, I want to have an adult conversation about issues with baiting. Okay? And if we can mitigate or look at these specific issues and at least address them and have an adult conversation in this room, then there may be a chance to move the bill and let the body have a vote. Okay? But I'm going to tell you, I'm going to set the framework for what the adult conversation is. I don't want to go over ad nauseum 2011 why, it's good for me to have baiting, or I can put more deer, or, look at and manage my herd better, all that. That's all anecdotal information. So we're going to focus on two key issues that I really impact the hunters of this state and that were brought up in 2011, and I believe we've got some conflicts in code, and I believe we need to talk about some risk, as this committee is responsible for the livelihood and to make sure that Georgia continues to be a great place to hunt and fish. We need to make sure that as we make decisions and policy decisions, that we have discussed this from at a policy level to make sure this state knows exactly what it's doing and what the potential risks are going forward. So with that, I'm going to tell you that the two issues that I want this subcommittee, and I want this, and if the bill moves forward, this committee as a whole to make sure that we are addressing. One, there is a conflict between different hunting groups who are lawfully pursuing game in this state. All right? And then second of all, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, if somebody says that corn causes diseases, I'm going to tell you it doesn't. I don't want to hear that comment. Or baiting causes diseases. What I want to make sure that this committee and this subcommittee discusses is the risk associated with supplemental feeding and baiting. That's the current risk that we have. No less if we're going to expand that current policy going forward. And if we can have an adult conversation and look at these issues and possibly address the issues and make sure we understand all this, then again, I will keep to my word to my chairman and my friend that we'll go forward. However, and I'm going to look over here because, Dominique, I don't want any painting me in a corner now. You did it last time. Okay? It's an adult conversation.
That's 6 times you've said adult to imply that there's childish conversation.
I'm putting, as the chairman of this committee, we're going to focus, and we're going to focus on real policy issues that are important to all of Georgia's hunters. And if we can address them, okay, then there's a possibility we go forward. Is that fair enough? Otherwise, I didn't have to call this meeting, and I can assure you, there's probably another chairman in this room that probably, Mr. Meadows, Chairman Meadows, you got anything to add? So, again, guys, I don't like the issue, but I know this is the deliberative body. Let's talk about this. So with that, first thing we're going to do is Chairman McCall, is the House bill and the Senate bill basically the same bill? Exactly. Okay. So obviously from a procedural point of view, the Senate bill is the one that's in play. So Senator Payne, if you will, briefly, let's get up, let's introduce your bill and what it does. And then after that, I want us to start to discuss and talk about some of the issues that we need to discuss if this is going to be a policy going forward. The witness mic is right there next to Dominique.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for Senate Bill 450. It's LC 440713. And as you had mentioned, the issues that had been addressed, and this bill was passed in 2011 that allowed supplemental feeding in Georgia, but only for the southern half of the state, as you outlined. All this bill does is make it a universal law for the state of Georgia. It doesn't change the law, it just makes what's currently happening in South Georgia permitted in North Georgia. Also, DNR has reported that following 2011 institution of the law in South Georgia, there was never any notable increase in the number of deer taken each year. And also those claims of worry about disease have never come to fruition either. And so that was, those were the two primary concerns and back in that time of that debate. And like I said, all this bill does is allow hunters in North Georgia to live under the same law as the hunters in South Georgia. Also, like I said, the primary concerns were always it gives hunters an unfair advantage. That was the concern back when the bill was first proposed back in 2011, and also the disease issue. And neither one of those ever come to fruition. The number of deer taken have never really increased from above average since it was passed in South Georgia. So since those things never came to fruition, all we're saying is just, if it needs to, since that's the law in South Georgia, why not just let it be the law for the entire state of Georgia?
One, we talked, and I haven't necessarily seen any updated data, but you say that do we have numbers comparing the harvest prior to the 2011 baiting issue and post for South Georgia? Obviously, you said that
that's what at the subcommittee, committee meeting in the Senate, that's what was presented by DNR, that really has not been substantial. There was never any. That's what was alluded to by the questioning, and I was really unaware of that at the time. So
okay, all right. Let me ask you. I know, Senator Payne, you're recent to the General Assembly, so I know you don't have the benefit of history. But again, going back to, I think what I'm trying to make sure that we're addressing are some issues. With, first of all, many members on this committee who are new, and some who probably should have known they were elected, but do you realize that we passed a constitutional amendment in 2006 Do you know what constitutional amendment that was?
I'm racking my brain trying to think. No, sir, I don't.
I asked this question to the committee. Anybody? Okay. So we passed, and Georgians felt so strongly that we passed a constitutional amendment in 2006 that protected the tradition of hunting and fishing in Georgia.
Yes, sir.
So I guess that's leading me into, have you looked at the existing code surrounding this bill regarding the issue of potential conflicts between deer hunting, because it is legal in Georgia to hunt deer over bait and hogs, okay, versus other hunters? Was that discussed in the Senate committee?
No, sir.
Okay. So that, again, that's an issue that I want to have an adult conversation with. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. Could you repeat that? My wife had and I'll be honest, my wife had sent me a message I was trying to reply to. Could you repeat that last statement?
Well, that's the issue I want to talk about, as we alluded to. I don't think it was talked about in the Senate.
Which issue though? That's what
That is the issue of the conflict between the hunter groups
Okay.
or adjoining landowners regarding putting one hunter in jeopardy of baiting, because in Georgia currently only deer hunting and hog hunting is permitted. Okay.
Right.
So again, not looking at it's the code outside of this particular code that's on this bill that I think this subcommittee needs to look at and make sure that we're not jeopardizing other people. Okay. So that's again, I'm just being up front.
Yes, sir.
The second thing is, and I guess this leads into, and again, I don't, nobody's saying that baiting or supplemental feeding causes communicable diseases within the deer population. But did y'all address the issue of communicable diseases such as CWD among others in the Senate hearing?
No, sir. Other than just like I said, the report that there was never an increase
Okay.
in any disease in South Georgia.
What do y'all? When was this bill passed out of Senate? Do you know, or when you heard it in the testimony in the Senate committee?
I don't know the date, but a couple of weeks ago. I'm sorry. I would have more. My
I just
printer in my
in general,
office
yeah.
was broken, and I couldn't print everything I wanted to print this morning.
One of the issues that I want us to discuss is, I'm not sure if the committee's familiar with it, but there was an outbreak of CWD in Mississippi, a state that up until January, the third week or so in January, I think it was, had not had CWD. 23rd. Okay. So again, this is not that baiting causes it; it's the risk that is associated with it. So again, I want to make sure that we start to discuss that issue.
Did they determine? If you beg the question, I mean, did they determine what caused the CWD in Mississippi?
They don't know where it has come from.
Okay.
My understanding, and I think there may be folks here that can talk more in detail, but this was a native deer, not a import.
Right.
It was a 3.5, 4-year-old buck, which was a hot case, and so it was native. They did get the genetics back, and it was not a imported deer, if I'm reading the information right, which means it was a native deer to that population.
Yes, sir.
So those are things I want to make sure that we're addressing going forward. Before we do this, I want to make sure this committee understands what is our state's response plan, if it has one, if it's available. What is it? What is the risk that we are taking? What is it economically going to cost us? What is it going to cost the hunters? Because quite frankly, I think to maybe see what Mississippi's doing may be a good idea. At least talk about it. And again, let's talk about what it could mean to Georgia's hunters, fishermen, and our economy to make sure we understand that if we go down this road, the risks that are associated with baiting. And it's not necessarily adding to the new baiting in North Georgia, the potential is looking at what we already have.
Yes, sir.
and have in South Georgia. So those are things. Any questions from the committee regarding these issues?
We've got a couple.
Okay.
When you say competition with
What mic are you on, Steve?
when you talk about other animals, you're talking about like dove fields or.
Yes.
And I'm not being flippant, but I'm squirrels. I mean, well, dove fields and maybe turkey does anybody bait anything but deer and hogs in the United States? I'm not.
Yeah,
Anybody allow it?
turkeys.
But, yeah, they allow it.
Illegally?
I just didn't know if they baited any other animals. First of all, I may never deer hunt again in my life, and if I do, I literally am going to deer hunt with a pistol. I've never hunted over bait, and I ain't gonna hunt inside a fence. But people are baiting in South Georgia, and so I'm guessing this may not be appropriate. Are we talking about stopping baiting in South Georgia?
We're talking about the issues that whether it's the existing law right now, there are some issues that I think this body needs to look at.
It's more of a statement, but something you said in that Constitution last week, it was treating all hunters the same. So
Well,
that's what I want to address, is treating all hunters the same, and you can ask all the hunters you know, and about 60% of them or 70% are going to say they want to hunt over bait, and the other 30% forbid it. So,
well,
just from my point of
Yeah.
view, not knowing all the details and being experienced, I support this idea of letting North Georgia do what South Georgia does.
Well, it's not necessarily an issue of, within the deer community that that is an issue, because you do have some hunters who don't want to hunt on bait and some that do. But it's the issue of, under state law, you cannot bait any other animal with the exception of deer and hogs.
Mm-hmm.
So turkeys, quail, all the small game, bear, everything else is illegal to bait deer, okay? In addition to that, Georgia is, when it comes to the migratory birds, okay,
Federal.
which is dove, mainly in Georgia you would see dove and duck.
Federal.
It is a federal issue, and state law does not trump the feds regarding that issue, okay? And those are the conflicts that we're talking about. So when I look at code, and I apologize, I brought the entire code, or I printed out the code yesterday, was making some notes. When I look at the code section, do we, for instance, if this policy is going to proceed or continue in North Georgia, and only look at what's existing in South Georgia, when it has a conflict, how do you look at the law? How do we make sure that we're not entrapping another hunter, okay, with boundary lines? Because I can tell you anecdotally that South Georgia has larger tracts of land. So while it may be less prevalent or we haven't seen it yet, not saying it won't happen, it probably will. It is going to happen at some point. But in North Georgia, our tracts of land tend to be smaller. So the problems will probably be exacerbated. So perhaps somebody who is supplemental feeding deer, okay, which is basically outside of the baiting and not shooting them over the feed, but supplemental feeding meaning outside of the season, could be supplemental feeding deer, but yet in jeopardizing an adjoining landowner as far as maybe turkey hunting, or maybe it's duck hunting, depending on the situational aspect of property lines, okay? That's what I'm that's what I'm talking about right now.
So I'm sorry. To take this chair.
To that point, the supplemental feeding, is that not legal now? Can't
It
they
is.
legally
And-
do
and
that
that's-
now?
that is-
It would,
yes.
both of these questions,
Yeah.
issues you're talking about.
Representative
Pre-
Corbett,
precedent
you're
legal.
exactly right. It is legal now, and it was an issue that was brought up in 2011. Okay, quite frankly, I brought it up with Leg Council, and it was everything was overlooked. And while we may not have had problems up to this point in the state of Georgia through DNR, we've got a great commissioner, we've got a great colonel, who probably has looked at this and made sure that there's good judgment that is being processed. The current code as it stands, though, is in conflict with what could happen. And, you know, we don't make laws right now regarding, you know, we make laws that go into the future. So my point is we may not have a Mark Williams as a commissioner or a Colonel Henderson as the colonel that is overseeing the judgment part. We could come out 10 or 15 years from now and have somebody else. And the laws as it is written now will put people in jeopardy, especially if the people on the ground, i.e. LE, is not exercising some good judgment. Because if you look at the law, it's very, very clear that there's conflict there. And so that's what I want us to address, if you will, in this, to make sure that we can mitigate that conflict or look at the conflict so that we can put people in a position where they're not going to get in jeopardy, especially a landowner who's trying to do the right thing on his land or her land, pursuing game legally, but yet are put in jeopardy by adjacent landowner. Okay?
All right.
Any other questions from the committee? Hold on, is that Dominique? Are you 10? Who's 10? I'm sorry. 10's blinking.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess again to clarify kind of where we are, I feel like we're sort of questioning the chairman and not questioning the sponsor of the bill, so I want to try to bring it back to you. A lot to say, Senator, as far as the simple bill that you've brought to us. I just wanted to be clear that in Georgia currently, the way that we look at law, we have case law, and then we'll have the code section, the statute of law that's codified. I think one of the things you mentioned was that based on the case law in South Georgia and the data that you bring, CWD has not been a concern, correct?
Correct. As of this date.
The number of deer that are harvested over supplemental feed in South Georgia has not been a problem, correct?
Correct.
Which would lead me to the facts currently under the cases presented that supplemental feed has posed no problems. Would that be fair?
That is my understanding.
And in that, would you be willing to drop any bill based on the hypothetical scenarios of what might happen in the future? That's not typically how we legislate. Would you agree with that? That we legislate with data and facts and not hypothetical scenarios of what might happen a year or who might be the commissioner. Would that be fair?
That would be fair. The only, I would say also, just the element, always the suspect element would be the human behavior, as far as what might happen, because that is something we can look at, because it's
And just
there's a history of that we can make rational assumptions upon. But
just a follow-up, if I might, that management is a very critical element of what outdoorsmen do in the area of deer and hogs.
yes,
And the reason that we allow supplemental feed for deer and hogs has really been a management issue to try to decrease the deer population to prevent high deer densities and more automobile accidents and more crop damage and things like that.
right.
That's it. Thank you so much.
Next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I was,
Oh, hold on a second.
Yeah.
There you go.
y'all already cutting me off, aren't you? I wanna dial back, Mr. Chairman, when you were giving the examples, and I was just sitting here trying to think, you were using the duck and turkey hunting as an example of some unintended consequences that could arise. And I understand what you're saying, Representative LaRicki, about, you know, we don't really deal on hypotheticals. We try to put as many safeguards in as we can, but I think to stay in the ballpark of what we're talking about, you know, duck hunting it isn't gonna. I don't think you're gonna get a fine for duck hunting over deer corn, or hog corn. To bait ducks properly, you're gonna put it in a little bit of water, and if you're corn, and majority of the time you're gonna use molasses and yeast and not corn. I mean,
well, look, we're digressing here.
no,
and
I'm gonna circle back around, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect to my point, the duck hunting I can kind of discount. The turkey hunting and the smaller tracts of land you reference, that's where I'm going. I wanted to just go ahead in my mind say I don't think the duck hunting is an issue on what we're talking about here with unintended consequences. However, when you start dealing with smaller tracts of land, I can see, and everybody knows the best hunting on your hunting club is the landline. Do we all agree that? If you're a hunter, you know all the deer stands and the turkey blinds are put on the landline. And I just want to make sure I understood your illustration earlier. You and I are sharing neighboring properties, 50 acres apiece. You bait and I don't. You baiting year round to keep your herd up, you wait, whatever. I'm over on my land turkey hunting, and I'm on the landline. I got a big tom spitting and drumming, he's coming to me. I snap off when he gets on my property. But your corn, if I draw a line to it from where I'm sitting, is either in eyesight or it's in a illegal distance to me. Is that your main concern there?
Yes.
I'm trying to be fair in my mind, listening to that, and I understand it. And I understand that we won't always have the department leadership we've got now in the DNR and the law enforcement. I do understand that. But I do have to give the benefit of the doubt, and I say that with a gulp. That I could not imagine if, same illustration, Mr. Knight's baiting, Mr. Nimmer's not. I shoot a turkey on my land, Knight had baited on his. I didn't know he was baiting. I don't go on his property. Ranger Dubnik shows up and writes me a ticket because he baited. I just can't see that ticket being cited. I don't see it being written. I may be way misled on that one, but
Well, I think you need to look at the law. The law is the law. It's not what you and I see. It is how a game warden, LE ranger, interprets the law. And let me go back to two things. I know you've discounted
the ducks.
the ducks, but I'm sitting here, and this is printed off late February. I'm looking at the Federal Fish and Wildlife waterfowl and hunting and baiting. This is directly from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it goes through duck hunting. And y'all can go look at the webpage. But it says feeding waterfowl and other wildlife. Many people feed waterlife for the pleasure of bird watching. It is illegal to hunt waterfowl in an area where such feeding has occurred that could lure or attract migratory game birds to, on, or over any area where hunters are attempting to take them. The 10-day rule applies to such areas. To such areas, any salt grain feed must be gone for 10 days before hunting. The use of sand and shell grit is not prohibited. In some areas, it is a legal hunting practice to place grain to attract some state-protected game species, i.e. white-tailed deer. But these areas would be illegal for waterfowl hunting, and the 10-day rule would apply. That's not my words. That's the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay? Guys, we make laws so that people know what they can and can't do. Okay? That's what I'm trying to talk about as far as us having a real conversation to make sure that there are policies or they're put in place in law such that we're not going to jeopardize another hunter. As far as case law, okay, we can look at all the state case law you want, but when it comes to federal migratory birds, federal law and the federal case law will reign. And there is case law that does show the conflict. So let's talk about this to see if we can mitigate or put into law, okay, if we want these measures to continue. You want to go forward with North Georgia baiting, much less look at the issues that exist up under South Georgia to see if we can make sure that we're protecting all of our hunters and not necessarily giving the deer hunter or the hog hunter a super lien, if you will, okay, in hunting. Because I don't think that was the intent of the constitutional amendment that we had, nor do I think it's the intent of any of the folks in this body that voted on the bill in 2011 to give one hunter an advantage or a super lien over another. One more question, and I want to get to this. I know we got people to speak.
Just for
All right.
clarification, because I wasn't here.
Three. Who's three? Okay. Oh, hold on a second. Tom's next.
That's fine.
I think Tom was the next blinking light.
Was it?
I can wait.
No, go ahead. I mean, if it's up to you. You were just next blinking light.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I need to explain, since I was the main sponsor in the House of the exact language that the senator has, there's several reasons why, and out the gate, I don't deer hunt. I probably kill more deer than anybody sitting in this room, but I don't hunt. I do it as a survival method because of what I do for a living. There's several reasons, and if I jump around, Mr. Chairman, I apologize. You mentioned the 2006 amendment, the right to hunt. A fellow I grew up with, son, who is autistic, and our whole deal is promoting hunting for younger people to get them interested in it. We're sitting in a deer stand one day, and the game warden came by and checked him. And then evidently the game warden had been to this place before, because prior to deer season they had a feeder over the hill because hogs were so bad in this particular field. They were rooting it all up. They had moved the feeder about a month before deer season opened. Game warden walked over the hill and came back with 3 kernels of corn in his pocket and charged this kid with hunting over bait. Now, it got thrown out. But if supplemental feeding had been legal in North Georgia, then he never could have charged him. If you are sitting in a deer stand eating an apple and you just flip it out, drop it on the ground or whatever, game warden shows up, the core is laying on the ground, he can charge you with hunting over bait. I'm just saying what he can do, not that he will. That's the kind of stuff that there's a conflict between what may be legal on that wherever the line in Crawford County is, whether you're on this side of the line or this side of the line, that the game warden has to make a decision on whether you're hunting in North Georgia or South Georgia and whether you're really baiting or not. I can plant I can plant a food plot, which I don't see any difference between food plots and baiting. I can plant an acre of corn, take a bush hog out there, bush hog it down, and the ground be yellow, and sit in the middle of it, and that'd be legal. Not that that's a normal agricultural practice, but it would be legal. So there's no difference, in my opinion, in that and pulling out a sack of corn. You can put corn, as long as you're 200 yards from it, you can put up a piece of plywood and you can't see it and be exactly 200 yards. Somewhere in the law, too, I think, that you're talking about messing up your neighbor. If you're baiting, you have to be a certain number of yards from the land line, don't you?
No.
Well, I know we talked about it in 2011.
Mr. Chairman, you're right, and this goes back to the point, and again, I want to reiterate. We debated all the kids and all that. I want to focus on two things. If this committee is serious about trying to look at the baiting issue, let's seriously look at two issues and see if we can try to, in code, make sure we put a solid foundation for the future to prevent issues, okay?
I was
Because
just
if that-
explaining why
I know.
did it.
But if that kid, though, had been hunting turkey instead of deer, okay, and you had implemented a North Georgia, same as South Georgia, and that kid had been, that disabled child had been hunting turkey, okay, then it could have been a very different story, even if you had passed a North Georgia baiting issue. That's what I'm trying to get at, Mr. Chairman. And it doesn't matter what I like as far as ethically the baiting issue or not. There are underlying issues that I want this committee to look at and to take into account.
But there's no difference in the dove field that you have your fundraiser over, other than the law says it's legal to plant a food plot than it is pouring out corn.
Mr. Chairman, but when you look at the federal issues, I'm sorry, I just got the full code, and we'll talk about this, and I do want to make sure we get to some of the guests today. But you go back to normal agricultural practices. Our state baiting laws go back to what is normal agricultural practice that is set by the University of Georgia state agronomist or extension agents. Okay?
I understand.
So there is that is set. So as long as you're within normal agricultural practices as defined by the state extension agent, okay, that's where we
I guess my point is maybe that needs to be changed, because bush hogging down 200 bushel corn ain't a normal agricultural practice.
well,
But it's legal to hunt over it.
it may be, but you also got federal laws. And my point, though, guys, is in looking at this, if you go to the section, the only part about it, about not putting your adjacent land on it, says, provided, however, that any such lure or attraction or enticement shall not cause hunting on an adjoining property to be prohibited under section B of this code, which B is the exception for baiting deer, okay? So, what does that mean? I don't know if there's somebody here from LE or DNR that can speak to that issue. But that's the only part in the code that is there. Does it mean that by law, if your neighbor baits, you can't be in jeopardy of baiting on your property? Or does that mean it's going directly to the adjacent landowner? It says you can't put your adjacent landowner in a jeopardy of baiting or cause your neighbor to be in a baiting situation. So what one is it?
It-
Can I make one brief comment on that issue? Currently, in Georgia, for the last 20 years, in all the years I've hunted, you can pour out corn statewide in every county, on every track. What this bill, in essence, does is move the hunter 200 yards. That's all it does. You can currently pour out corn everywhere in Georgia
I-
where none of these concerns have been raised.
Representative Ricky, I understand that. But that is not the discussion that I'm asking this committee to focus on. So if we're not gonna focus on these areas that are gonna put people in jeopardy or subject it to the judgment of law enforcement going forward, then we don't need to even continue this discussion in this committee. I've promised, and I keep my word, that we're gonna have an honest discussion. If we can address these issues, then we'll move forward with legislation. But if you don't want to address things that are going to be very important or that will jeopardize hunting or future hunters or landowners in this state, then there's no sense in continuing, because we're going to be at the same stalemate that we were. So that's what I'm asking you to look at the issues, and if either you're not taking what I'm saying seriously, or you debate it, or you dismiss it. But these are issues, clear issues up under the conflict. The Federal Fish and Wildlife, okay, says problem. Okay? Problem. That's their words, not mine. So that's what I'm asking people. Do we put something in code that puts an adjacent landowner on notice, or gives a duck hunter, somebody who's very, say, Representative Dugnick's out there and he's got part of his property adjoins your property and part of it's a swamp, and you know he's a duck hunter. Can he go over and say, Representative Laricchia, I'm going to be duck hunting in this. Please don't put me in jeopardy of baiting, and put you on notice so that he can legally hunt his land, okay, without fear of the federal game warden coming in, or for that matter, the state game warden coming in, because the state has to follow the federal rules in migratory situations. Or, Chairman McCall, in a situation of, a dove shoot, whether it's mine or somebody else's. Deer season usually starts about September the 15th, doesn't it? With bow season. So all of a sudden, Jason's got a nice dove field that he's worked on. He's got sunflowers galore out there. But on the other side of the hedgerow, somebody's put a spreader and sitting there spreading corn. What do you do in that situation? That's what I'm asking us to focus on, not debating. I'm asking you to focus on the conflict there that is real, and that according to the code, we've got issues with. Is that fair enough?
But,
And
okay.
I made the comment because they currently pour it out now.
And that's what I told this group in the beginning. Is not just about moving forward with the northern zone. It's to examine the issues that we have currently. Do you want to get in a situation where you're in jeopardy? Do you? That's the question that I think this body, or this subcommittee, needs to answer, because eventually one of our hunters, our fellow hunters, our family of hunters, we're going to get in a conflict. So, guys, we're running out of time, and we've got people who have come to do this. We're going to have, we'll have a subcommittee. I'll schedule a subcommittee for Thursday. Okay, we're going to continue this debate, because I'm going to hold to my word that we're going to address this issue. I'm going to take one or two more comments very briefly, and then we're going to get to the folks who've come in.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The two things I wanted to address.
Hold on.
Yeah, I'm telling y'all, you keep doing it to me. One little announcement, they turned my mic off. But two things that you addressed. One, most everybody in here either is a hunter or has hunted in some capacity. There's a right of personal responsibility with any privilege we have. I want to go back to you rose a good issue about the duck hunting and what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Code says there, or their concern says. There's a personal responsibility on your land, whether that be leased land or personal owned land, whatever the land is that you are hunting. You've got rights to hunt there. It's legitimized in your contract, whatever the case may be. I want to make sure we're clear. We're talking about legitimate authority and permission to hunt a piece of property, whether by own, lease, rent, whatever. You've then got to be responsible enough, much like the dog hunting debates of years ago, with how now they have to register trucks and dogs and turn everything in. You've got to know, don't deer hunt, don't duck hunt if you've got water on that property. Don't plan on having your deer stand in a feed pile near where you're going to duck hunt. That's internal. I think you've got to make the smart decisions, or yes, you have opened yourself up subject to a fine. When it deals with a neighboring landowner, go back to you and I, neighboring landowners, I would use the example that if same example, 50-acre landowners apiece, we're adjacent landowners. If you're growing marijuana on your land, they can't write me a ticket for it. If you're baiting on your land and I'm hunting on my land, they've got to prove that I've crossed over, trespassed, hunted, drew game from you. They're not going to
No.
write that ticket.
No,
we
no,
we,
no, no,
we
no,
debated
no,
that
no.
in
We-
2011 pretty
That is
thoroughly.
not what case law says. Okay, if we're going to go back to case law, that's not what it says, and that's not what the law says, guys. So pay attention. We got to protect our hunting family, and that's the very issue.
And
that-
I hear you, and I'm
that-
trying to
that-
stay to the issue that you
that-
brought
yeah,
up.
but that's the very issue that we need to look at and we need to follow. The law says it's the area. It doesn't go by boundary or property, okay? And you don't have to trespass on my land in order to be baiting. It is by distance, it is by circumstances, individual, especially with migratory birds, okay? That is the issue. That is one of the examples. The other example is the turkey, okay? We know logging roads.
those seasons don't even line up.
It doesn't matter. It's supplemental feeding, and that's what one of the issues. Dominique, I've said, yes, you can, but we need to address the issue. It doesn't take the issue away. So with that, guys, we've got limited time. We've got, all right.
I gotta go and I apologize, we're gonna have another meeting. Has these problems that you're, and I'm trying to get my head around it, the problems you're talking about, is it a problem in South Georgia now? Sir?
Yeah, but hold on, that's not the question. The question is what does Georgia law say? We don't write laws that are ambiguous that leave it up to the judgment, okay, of law enforcement. We write laws so that the citizens, okay, understand what the law is and what they can and can't do. And that's the issue that is here. And if you haven't bothered to read this whole code section, then I would encourage you to read it. I, for one, don't want to get in a situation where I am placed by somebody getting in jeopardy and saying, why did you let this occur? Why am I now in trouble because your law was ambiguous and I got in trouble because it was ambiguous? So the question is not what is happening now. The question is what does the law say and what does it need to say if we're going to have baiting in Georgia in order to make sure that we don't jeopardize another hunter or another property owner? That's the question. Okay?
So if everybody's in agreement that you can bait now, you can put the corn out now, we understand that. Do we need to amend this and make it to where if in fact case law has been proven from the bench that what I said is inaccurate, then we add to this, if baiting's not the issue and protecting your neighbor is,
Yeah, I mean,
so we're
it's,
good with baiting all over Georgia, we just wanna make sure that we protect our neighbor. I mean,
well, from a legal point of view, and that will be for the body to decide. But my point is you make law that protects all your hunters. And if you can do that and you want to bait, then that's fine.
I think Mr. Higley's over
So-
there typing away already.
So, but guys, with that, we've had people that have signed up. I want to hear them, and I'm going to schedule a subcommittee meeting for Thursday, okay? And we'll come back and we'll hit this issue again. And I'm ready to tackle it and to see if we can find a way to mitigate the issues that we've got, make sure the code is as tight as it can be that protects all hunters, and then we'll allow for a debate and a body decide. With that, we've got 3 people who signed up. Mike Worley, Chuck, if you will, I'm going to let him.
Okay.
I'm a little bit nervous standing up here now. I appreciate everybody allowing me to be here. It's a real pleasure and honor. I will tell you one of the things that makes me very hopeful and very about the future of our hunting and our fishing here in the state is the passion that folks take in it. And I appreciate all the passion and the thoughtfulness that's been brought to this issue so far. I'm Mike Worley, President and CEO of the Georgia Wildlife Federation. We've been around for 82 82 years. We were formed by hunters and anglers. We still advocate on behalf of those hunters and anglers. And we also advocate for the professional science-based management of our wildlife and our resources. As a result, we simply can't stand aside for a proposal that's kind of counter to those values. So I want to just kind of, and y'all probably y'all already know these, I'm sure, but just to lay out some specifics here, we've got about 630,000 deer hunters here in Georgia. I'm sorry, 630,000 total hunters. 82% of those are deer hunters, so about 500,000 deer hunters here in the state. Roughly, the economic impact of that number of deer hunters is approximately $890 million in rural Georgia, largely. So, a critical issue, and I think one that I appreciate like I said, the passion that folks are taking here on this issue. I'd like to just point out a few issues that we have both with supplemental feeding and with the baiting component, and glad to answer any questions that you have. I'll try and run through these pretty quickly. Supplemental feeding artificially concentrates animals. It does provide opportunities for disease transmission and alters deer behavior, and also promotes overpopulation for specific habitats. That's what baiting does. It provides for the land to have more deer than it normally could support. I've added in a bullet point to what I would normally have talked about here, just because of the critical issues that have been raised by the discovery of chronic wasting disease in Mississippi. I'd like to share a couple of things about that disease with you. CWD is always fatal, 100% fatal for the deer that get it. The disease is from a group of diseases called transmissible. I kind of talk about that. Transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. Transmissible means it can be caught. And it's got an incubation period of about 17 months. It's the contagion, which is called a prion, is contained in the saliva, urine, and other bodily fluids of that animal, and can be shed in the environment, meaning that particularly as it gets later, it can drop those prions in the environment, and they are virtually indestructible in that environment. They will last for years wherever that deer drops those prions. They can't be cleaned with bleach. They can't be cleaned with anything. It virtually cannot be destroyed. And as the science is inconclusive. It could last for years. It could last for decades in that spot. So anyway, case of CWD was confirmed in Mississippi within the last 3 weeks. So it's now in 23 states, 2 Canadian provinces, Norway and South Korea. The Mississippi case was a native white-tailed deer. You'll hear reported in the next couple of days that the state has killed and tested 64 deer there in Mississippi in the 5 Mile area, and all of those deer were listed as non-detectable. Interestingly enough, in that case, the landowner where the infected deer was found has never allowed feeding or baiting. Hope is that them not allowing feeding or baiting might limit the spread of this disease. I'm not going to go through the whole list of things, but the Mississippi State Department of Health recommends, this is one of the recommendations on their website right now that was just put on there. Out of abundance of caution, the Mississippi State Department of Health recommends that hunters consider not eating venison from deer harvested within the CWD management zone as defined by the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. Folks, this is a horrendous disease. It is huge, and it has the potential to be a tremendous impact on that economic story that we tell about South Georgia. I'm not going to go through all the other recommendations they make, but it's a bunch, and I'd encourage you to go look at that on the website. What's the very first response that we have when we find CWD? The very first response in our plan that's developed by our State Department of Natural Resources is to stop feeding and baiting in the area that is found. Clearly, we recognize that feeding and baiting are a problem. Multiple studies have shown. Now, I'm going to move away from the CWD and the disease stuff. we talk about controlling the population. I heard some folks say something about that. The numbers here in Georgia, multiple studies have shown that baiting of deer reduces hunter success. Prior to the year prior to the allowing baiting in the southern zone, Georgia harvested 449,000 deer. In 2016, 2017, in that zone, Georgia harvested 316,000 deer, a 30% reduction from the year before baiting was allowed. Harvest, the deer harvest.
No, killed.
That's correct. That's correct. So the number of deer killed by hunters went from $449,000 the year before baiting was instituted. 449,000 deer to 316,000 deer in 2016, 2017.
That's in the southern zone.
Yes, sir. That is in the southern zone. Go back to, and I really hate to jump into this one. The bill does not fully, nor can it fully, protect adjacent landowners from being unable to hunt on their own land, particularly if relative. It does state in there, state law does prevent it from interfering with hunting on adjacent land. The federal law, it cannot. And so the migratory game bird laws, waterfowl laws, as an example, I've got a piece of property with a swamp on the back of it that runs up to another landowner. If I indeed do want to go back and hunt, as I usually do, some wood ducks in that swamp, I have a landowner next door that does feed deer. If he chooses to feed those deer on the property line, which does run through our swamp, if he chooses to feed deer at that location, I cannot duck hunt in my swamp without risk of a federal ticket. Would like to say that the vast majority, as we talk about this, I'm going to be followed by some other wildlife biologists here. The vast majority of wildlife professionals agree that baiting is bad for the animals, bad for the sport, and bad for the future. The Wildlife Society, which is an organization made up primarily of wildlife professionals across the country, DNR professionals, academics, people that make a living in the wildlife world and study it and manage these animals. The Wildlife Society, made up largely of wildlife professionals, published an excellent report in 2006 that's still applicable today and perhaps is even more frightening given the advance of CWD in the interim. I'd suggest that we take a look at that. I'm not going to try and go through it. I do want to say thank you again for the opportunity to speak this morning. I appreciate the values and perspectives that you bring. Given Georgia's plan to eliminate feeding and baiting in areas when and if we find CWD in Georgia, I personally struggle with a decision to allow the expansion of baiting across the state when it would appear that the prudent course would be the elimination of baiting and feeding to protect the heritage of hunting. If we're really concerned about consistency, I would encourage you to think about eliminating baiting in that southern zone, but I know that's not the topic of the bill today. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'd be glad to answer any questions, but I know you've got a couple of more folks.
Again, for the discussions of this, I want to hear it, and then I think we want to set what this committee wants to come back and talk about and address, and I appreciate it, Mike. I do want to make sure those numbers are, if you'll confirm those numbers are southern zone versus statewide.
They are southern zones. I have.
All right, yeah, well, confirm that if you will. But again, I don't want to get into the issues. I think we want to hear things. And I want to set what this committee needs to do some homework and come back and address. If this bill is going to move forward, okay, then we need to look at things that we need to mitigate and address.
I'll get you
right.
that information
Okay.
for certain, sir. I'm sorry.
I
apologize.
I got these folks that are coming.
Again.
No, we're gonna have more debates on this. This is not a. All right, Brian, you want to come up, and I know we got Jed DeZell also, but if you will be brief and.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Brian Murphy. I'm the CEO of the Quality Deer Management Association. We're a Georgia-based national nonprofit conservation organization. Georgia ranks 4th nationally in membership in our organization. Our members own approximately 1 million acres in the state, so we have a very vested interest in what goes on here in the state of Georgia. And I personally have been involved with the baiting issue and the CWD issue for the past 20 years. I'm a wildlife biologist by training and travel the country working with these issues. So this one's very germane to me personally. And I do reside in the North Zone, avid deer hunter myself and my 2 daughters. And as a biologist and working with the best deer experts across the nation, the best disease experts as well, we certainly think it's our collective responsibility, the citizens of Georgia, to look after our resources and to do what's right. And despite the fact that approximately a third of our Georgia members would support baiting, whether it be in the North or the South, we still stand opposed to this bill, because it's our mission to do what's right for the resource first. The hunter will come second, but we have to have the resource protected first and foremost. And I'm going to focus on 2 points here this morning, keep it as brief as I possibly can, and one is risk and one is cost. And we talked about it already, that there is a risk already underway with feeding and baiting in the state. But what we're talking about is incremental risk here. And we follow this issue in other states where we followed the magnitude of food on the landscape prior to legalization of baiting and post, and the typical increase is 4 to 6-fold. When you go from a feeding situation to a baiting situation, the magnitude increase is approximately 4 to 6-fold, because a greater percentage of the community participates in the action, some offensively and some defensively, if you know what I mean. So there is an increase in magnitude. So as risk managers, and that's what we're talking about here, you're risk managers from a legal perspective, you're weighing that risk, and I understand that. And no, there's no evidence of CWD in this state, but Mississippi actually became the 25th state with CWD now, and I can almost assure you, unfortunately, that our day will come. It's a matter of time, unfortunately. Finally, to the cost, and I want to talk very briefly about the cost to the state agency, the cost to the state, and the cost to the hunter. And we actually surveyed 3 states that recently became CWD positive and asked them what they were doing prior to from a testing and financial standpoint, and what they're now having to do once they've discovered CWD. And the average increase in the number of samples taken is about 3,800 per state. And if you look at a cost of about $25 a sample, that's about $100,000, and you say, well, that's not too bad. That's just the cost of getting the sample analyzed. And Texas has done a good job analyzing the full cost of that, and it's roughly $100 a sample, or $400,000 to just simply test at a reasonable level to detect the prevalence rate of the disease. That does not include targeted culling efforts like Mississippi had to go do and go target and cull 64 additional animals. It does not cover the cost of public outreach, public meetings, website, pamphlets, all the I&E time as well. So it's easy to estimate approximately $1 million in year 1 post-discovery of CWD. That's a reasonable number backed by data. What would be the cost to the state of Georgia? The best study that I've seen actually comes from one of our neighbors to the north, Tennessee. Ag economics professors at UT calculated the cost to their state, which is much smaller from a hunting standpoint than Georgia, should CWD be discovered there. And their estimate was $46 million in direct costs and $98 million in total costs. And that's looking at fuel, transportation, lodging, food, again, mostly to rural communities. Mind you, this is mostly a rural issue, so I know Georgia's really strong on rural economics right now, and this would be a heavy blow to them. This does not include the cost to the state agency. If we see what we saw in Wisconsin, for example, where they lost 50,000 hunters that never came back following discovery of CWD, talking about a decrease in licensed sale revenue, obviously, but also the matching Pittman-Robertson dollars. So you're talking about a heavy financial blow to the state agency at a time that they're having to spend more on CWD management, and taking away at the same time things like, new boat ramps and wildlife management areas and public outreach. So huge cost there. And finally, obviously, the world changes, and I speak with hunters almost daily from around the country that are new to the CWD issue, and it's frightening because they're scared, they're uncertain of what the disease will do to their area. The property values, many of our members own or lease land, property values decline sharply with CWD. But also simply the new restrictions they're under, the loss of feeding, the loss of baiting, the loss of minerals, loss of natural urine products, for example, mandatory testing, et cetera. But I'll end with one quote that came from a member of ours who sent it to me, and this gentleman resides in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin, for those that may not know, was the first state east of the Mississippi to discover chronic wasting disease. That was in 2001. So they have a long history with it. And they have the highest infection rates. In fact, approximately 40% of their bucks in the target area now test positive for CWD. So I'll end with this quote. And this is from a gentleman named Bob Wieland from Wisconsin. Having hunted Iowa County, Wisconsin for the past 20 years, I wouldn't wish CWD on my worst enemy. We used to enjoy hunting the property, but for the past several years, every buck we have harvested has tested positive for CWD. We no longer harvest bucks older than 4.5 years, and we now find promising young bucks lying dead. It's like walking across the landscape of a black and white photo. CWD affects the psyche of the hunter as much as the animals themselves. And I'll end with simply saying thank you for what you do to protect the resources. We do oppose both of these bills on the basis of trying to protect the most valuable wildlife resource this country has. If we lose management of white-tailed deer in this country, we lose hunting as we know it. 51% of every dollar raised on hunting in this country comes on the back of one critter, the white-tailed deer, and so does our hunting heritage. So we thank you for what you do to help protect that resource.
Okay. Guys, I know we got rules coming up, but Jed, if you could.
Chairman, I apologize, but I did give you an incorrect statement. Those harvest numbers were statewide, not for the southern zone, so I apologize.
The number of hunters increasing or decreasing during that time, you know?
Roughly about the same. We haven't seen a 30% decrease.
Jed, if you'll tell us who you're with and.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm Jed Dazell. I'm a wildlife biologist with the Westervelt Company. We're a privately held timber company based out of Alabama. We own about 500,000 acres across the southeast, including 53,000 here in South Georgia. We employ 6 wildlife biologists. We manage a little over 800 hunting leases in the southeast. And I'm just going to talk a little bit today kind of about the baiting and some of the feeding stuff too. They'll kind of be interchanged, but I'm going to speak in opposition to the bill. And I'll say that I understand the logic behind people who want to see baiting in the north. If, we say if it's good enough for the people in the south, that'll be good enough for the north. My problem with that is that we're basing that on the assumption that what we're doing in the southern zone is good for deer hunters, it's good for deer, and it's good for other wildlife. And that's been talked about a lot, but I would argue that it is not. One of the arguments for wanting to have bait is that it allows hunters to be more successful. Putting out a feeder or a pile of corn and being able to hunt over it will allow you to see more deer in the daylight. And I'll just tell you that there are a lot of studies that have shown that to not be true. You heard Mike's statistics. Deer adapt their behavior to predatory behavior. We are predators, so deer behave accordingly to how we hunt them. I do camera surveys across the country, probably over 100 of them. I've probably looked at a couple 100,000 photos over the last 13 years. I would say over 90 to 95% of those photos which occur over bait piles are at night. They just don't utilize bait sites during the day. One of the things we've talked about is disease issues. We haven't talked a lot about non-target issues with baiting. One thing I hear from a lot of our hunters, and we're starting to hear state agencies talk about, is declining turkey populations. I don't know if you're familiar, but in November, the state came out with their strategic plan for wild turkeys in Georgia, published in November. From that, they wrote that turkey productivity between 2012 and 2015 was the lowest 4-year period on record. Now, is that a coincidence that in 2011 we allowed baiting to start happening in South Georgia? One thing we haven't talked about is aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is a poisonous fungi that grows on feed pellets and cereal grains, including corn. And when that gets wet, that toxin begins to grow, and within a matter of days, that corn becomes lethal to turkeys. It takes a lot longer for deer, so we don't see a lot of issues with it killing deer. It's also lethal to quail. So we have declining turkey populations, we have quail issues, and we've allowed more feed to go on the ground in southern Georgia. I think it's worth looking into, is there an impact there? We also have studies that show that bait piles attract other animals such as raccoons and skunks, both of which are major nest predators. There was a study that showed that within the vicinity of bait piles, there was a 30% increase in nest predation. That vicinity was 1 kilometer. On a hunting club, how many feeders do you think occur in a 1 kilometer space? There's a lot. It's a lot of interaction with nest predators and turkey nests. I'm just going to touch real quick on CWD. You know, it's been talked about. I think that a lot of people think that we use CWD as a scare tactic when we start talking about baiting and feeding. It's easy to think about CWD and kind of dismiss it because it's not here. But I will tell you that as a biologist, we are watching it spread. We've seen it come into North Arkansas. We've seen it come in now to North Mississippi. There's a chance it's here now. I mean, it takes 2 years for us to see signs in deer before they die. Deer die in the woods all the time. We don't know why. There's a chance it's already here. If you do your research on CWD and you talk to hunters and you talk to state agencies that are dealing with it, it will make you worry. It's not a scare tactic. It's a legitimate disease. We don't know a lot about it. We do know that baiting concentrates deer. Mike said it's transmissible, so it goes from deer to deer. So when they come in contact with each other, it spreads. It's also spread through saliva. So every time that their mouth is touching a feeder or it's touching a corn pile, the likelihood of contamination increases. The prions, they don't go away. I mean, they can last forever. We're seeing now that they're being uptaken into plants. So I'm not talking just about baiting. I'm talking about feeding in general to wildlife. Like I said, one of the things you heard him talk about was the landowner in Mississippi, Anderson Tully. They have not allowed baiting and feeding on their property ever. I believe that's probably one of the reasons that we didn't see other contaminated deer come out of that area. They haven't been concentrating them. We have recently, we own land in Virginia and Mississippi. Both are CWD positive states. We have decided last week to ban all feeding and baiting on those properties as well. We're not anywhere near contamination zone. We're also looking at the option of banning feeding and baiting on our ownership in Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. The resource is too valuable to us as a company. I mean, it's a multi-million-dollar revenue for us. We just don't think that the risk is worth it. We're talking to other timber companies who are looking at doing the same thing as private landowners trying to protect that resource. So I just feel like instead of justifying why the North Zone should be able to bait, we ought to be looking at the broader picture and perhaps eliminating it statewide. So with that, I'll take any questions and appreciate your time.
I appreciate it. This committee has gone long as far as time. But again, guys, there's two issues, and let's address it. Let's roll up our sleeve and address it. Okay? One is the conflict. And I'm gonna print out the whole code, but again, going back to the code, there are conflicts in the code, or they're ambiguous. What do we need to do to address conflicts? I'll give you an example. Later on in this code, we talk about doves. We talk about a ranger being able to require the removal of bait for doves. Is that across the board? Okay, that's already an existing code. But is it for turkeys, for ducks, for any other of the game? Again, what I'm talking about is to make sure that we're looking at conflicts with code. The other thing is a notification process. If that's where this thing wants to try to go, how do you put somebody on notice? Hey, I'm over here. Please don't jeopardize me. And I would encourage you to look at court cases, especially the federal court cases in migratory birds. It doesn't mean property line. Never has met property line. It could be a mile away, and they could still get you for baiting. I know but if you look at the federal case law, okay. And then what I'd like to do, Wes, is just to make sure, because this happened in Mississippi. What I'd like to do is to make sure that the state, what is our CWD response plan? I think all of a sudden in Mississippi, this thing, they had actually been working on one and testing animals. But they've got a pretty extensive framework of what the CWD response plan is. I'd like to see what ours are. For instance, and again, y'all go and Google this, Mississippi. They had a 5-mile like zone, 10-mile, and then 25-mile. So their first response was no baiting, no feeding within the zone, okay? But then what happens? They're starting to kill deer, starting to test. What has Georgia got in place? If we're gonna do this, and you still think that this is a good thing to do and the body decides that, then my question to you is to make sure that we know and that the Georgia hunters know, here's the risk we're taking. Are you willing to take the risk? And here's what's going to happen. I know we talked about some of the economics, okay? But what happens when you go in there and you start killing deer within a 10-mile radius and there are no deer left to hunt? Or they're looking at the CDC, and then you're looking at the state state health agencies. They're saying you don't eat deer. If it's in a contaminated area, their recommendation is don't eat them, or you have it tested before you eat. Again, guys, make sure we talk about the issue that is here. And if you want to take the risk, that's fine. Okay? That is absolutely fine. I don't like it, but I promised, and I made a commitment on my word that if we'll address the issue, okay, then you can do it. And, Mr. Chairman, you know, as far as ag, we protect it, okay? But this disease is sort of like, what is it, scrappies? Okay? So that's sort of the same. I want to make sure that a lot of our folks in our rural areas who are very protective, okay, of issues that are dealing with our livestock and our agriculture, I want you to know that as chairman of this committee and as a member of this committee for a long time, I'm as equally as protective and risk adverse, if you will, or want to weigh the risk, okay, of that. This is too important to Georgia's not only economy, to not know what those risks are, or know that if this is going to be a policy, not only existing policy in South Georgia, but going forward perhaps in North Georgia, that everyone is aware of the risk, and that our hunters are aware of the risk. That's what I mean by an adult conversation in the room. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to print out, and I'd ask y'all to review the whole code. I'm going to print out, and I'll email you, the whole code. Let's look at issues where you've got conflict of interest. How do we tighten that up? How do you protect one legal hunter who's pursuing a game animal over here that you cannot bait versus somebody that is? How do you do that? A notification process? Can you call a ranger? Can you write a letter? I don't know. I'm thinking out loud, just like, I'm sure Paul is over there going, legally, how do you do this? Okay? So at least that we're not jeopardizing somebody who is otherwise legally pursuing another game animal that is legal under the state of Georgia law and under federal law, okay? And then second of all, I think that this, again, I want the risk. Wes, what I would like to do is I would like to know what and I'm not talking about in a 2-minute, I'd like to know what our written policy is regarding our CWD response. What we're currently doing now, because I know we are testing, aren't we? I think there are. We're not. Are we testing, or does it start when the next state is?
I don't think we're testing now, but I think it's
Okay.
You are testing now.
We are testing.
You're pulling a couple hundred samples a year.
Okay. So it may be slight, but we are testing. And again, guys, we're sitting here with a committee. Do we even know that or not? But yet we're making decisions for all the hunters. Let's know exactly what we're doing, and let's know exactly what WRD will do should this pop up, just like it did 4 weeks ago in Mississippi, okay? So that at least we're making an educated decision on what the risks are. So I like that. The other thing is, and I didn't realize this, Wes, but What is the issue with the turkeys? Was there a study that was done, or the turkey plan?
You know, I don't know in terms of in relation to supplemental feeding, but I know, you know, some of the adjacent landowner issues, that's not generally an issue that we see very often.
Yeah, but speaking directly to the study, was a plan, a turkey plan, or was there a study, or with numbers? I'd like for us to talk about that.
Harvest numbers or?
No,
Talking about that, was there not also a study done by DNR that involved coyotes and fawns and the deer population going down, which could involve some of Mike's numbers?
oh, it could, yeah.
The years that he mentioned was related to turkey populations on drought. Was one of the number one issues in Georgia. Was not related to.
Well, that's fine. That's what, but I want to make sure that we look at numbers, because it's over a longer period of time, and droughts usually last a year or two. Not saying a cycle can't do it, but you usually have cycles. But again, just to put it out there, guys, and if we're going to do that, make sure we've covered our bases. The last thing we want to do is go back to the citizens and all of a sudden say, why didn't you think about this, or this has happened, or we get somebody in jeopardy. Okay. So those are within the two frameworks I'd like to do. If you haven't already, I'm gonna send a link. You can look at sort of the Mississippi, what they're doing in their first public comment period, public involvement regarding CWD and what their DNR did as far as their first one. Look at it. At least that'll give you an idea as to what potentially Georgia will be doing, and then we'll proceed. I'm going to schedule another committee hearing for Thursday, and we'll start looking at it. Probably in the morning, not 9, probably 8, because the chairman, yeah, we'll get an email out, but Chairman Meadows has rules, which I'm late for. Oh, wow. Oh, we got. Oh, you got ag meeting? Oh, field trip. All right. Well, we'll try to schedule something for Thursday afternoon. Okay. And we'll get an email out. Thank you, guys.
You know, part of your testimony.
But this is